A medieval nun invented an entire secret language, complete with its own alphabet. Another, back in the 900s, penned theatrical dramas featuring women outsmarting lecherous men, plays that were rediscovered centuries later. And one abbess's actual body, remarkably preserved, still sits on a special chair in her convent church today, a testament to her extraordinary life and writings. Number 10, Ende. The nun who signed her artwork in a 1,000-year-old book. Imagine opening a book from the year 975 and finding the artist's name written inside. That's what happened with Ende, a nun from medieval Spain. In a time when most artists, especially women, worked without ever signing their names, Ende made sure her contribution was known. She proudly identified herself in the colophon, a note at the end of a manuscript of the Gerona Beatus. This wasn't just any book. It was a beautifully illustrated copy of Beatus of Liébana's Commentary on the Apocalypse, and lived and worked in the 10th century, a period of rich cultural exchange in the Iberian Peninsula. The Gerona Beatus is a prime example of Mozarabic art, a style that blended Christian and Islamic artistic traditions. Its pages are filled with vibrant colors, dynamic figures, and intricate patterns, all designed to bring the terrifying and hopeful visions of the Book of Revelation to life. And signature line reads, Ende pintrix et de adiutrix, Ende woman painter and helper of God, followed by Frater Emeritus et Presbyter, identifying her collaborator, the priest Emeritus, who was likely the scribe, by calling herself pintrix, the feminine form of painter. She clearly stated her role and her gender. The monastery where Ende likely worked, the monastery of Tabara in the Kingdom of Leon, was renowned for its scriptorium, a room dedicated to copying and illustrating manuscripts. These scriptoria were vital centers of learning and art. Creating a manuscript like the Gerona Beatus was a massive undertaking, requiring expensive materials like parchment, pigments made from precious minerals and plants, and countless hours of skilled labor. Ende's illustrations are not just decorations. They are complex visual interpretations of the text, filled with symbolic meaning. She depicted multi-headed beasts, celestial battles, and serene images of paradise, all with a distinctive artistic flair. Her figures are expressive, and her use of color and composition is sophisticated. For Ende to sign her work was a remarkable act. It suggests a certain level of recognition and status within her community. While women in monastic orders had more opportunities for education and artistic expression than many laywomen claiming authorship so openly, was still unusual. Her name, Ende, Holbein, might be a form of the Basque word for treaty or agreement, or perhaps related to a Germanic name. Beyond her signature and her stunning artwork, little is known about her personal life. Yet, that signature, coupled with the breathtaking art she created, ensures her place in history. She wasn't just a pair of anonymous hands. She was Ende, a skilled artist who helped illuminate one of the most important manuscripts of her time, leaving her mark for over 1,000 years. Her contribution makes the Gerona Beatus not only a religious and artistic treasure, but also a rare testament to a named female artist from the early medieval period. Number 9, Baudonivia, the nun who wrote her saint's life story. In the early 7th century, a nun named Baudonivia picked up her stylus not to copy an ancient text, but to write something new. She lived in the Abbey of the Holy Cross in Poitiers France, a monastery famously founded by Queen Radegund. Radegund was a Thuringian princess who became a Frankish queen, then left her royal life to dedicate herself to God, and found this influential convent. Baudonivia's task was to write the life story of this very founder, Saint Radegund. This wasn't just any biography. It was a continuation of an earlier work by the famous poet Venantius Fortunatus, a close friend of Radegund. Baudonivia was a nun, living within the community that Radegund herself had established. This gave her a unique perspective. While Fortunatus wrote as an admirer from outside the cloister walls to some extent, though he was very close to Radegund, Baudonivia wrote from within as a spiritual daughter of the saint. Her Vita Sanctae Radegundis, Life of Saint Radegund, offers details and insights that only someone immersed in the daily life and spiritual legacy of the Abbey could provide. She wasn't just recounting events, she was preserving the memory and spiritual example of her community's foundress for future generations of nuns. Her writing reveals Radegund's intense piety, her acts of charity, her rigorous self-discipline, and her leadership. Baudonivia described Radegund's care for the sick and the poor, how she would personally tend to them. She also recounted Radegund's diplomatic efforts, such as mediating conflicts even from within the convent. Baudonivia's account emphasizes Radegund's devotion to the relics of the True Cross, which the Abbey housed, and from which it took its name. This relic was a gift from the Byzantine Emperor Justin II, obtained through Radegund's influence. What makes Baudonivia particularly noteworthy is that she was a woman writing hagiography, the life story of a saint about another woman, in an era when most historical and biographical writing was done by men. Her work shows that women in monastic communities were not only readers, but also creators of literature. She was likely well educated, with a good command of Latin, the scholarly language of the time. Her narrative is direct and filled with reverence for Radegund. She mentions that she undertook the work at the request of her abbess and sisters, showing that her writing was a communal endeavor, valued by her peers. Baudonivia's contribution is vital because it offers a female voice and perspective on female sainthood and monastic life in the early medieval period. Her work wasn't secret in her own community, but her role as an author is something that later centuries might have overlooked, simply because female authors from this period are rarer finds. Baudonivia ensured that Radegund's story, as seen through the eyes of her own nuns, would endure. Number 8. Caterina de Bologna. The saint who wrote a guide to spiritual battles and whose body never decayed. Catherine of Bologna, or Caterina de Bologna, was a 15th century Italian nun who was not only a writer, but also an artist and a mystic, and whose story has a truly astonishing postscript. Born into a noble family in Ferrara, she received a good education at court before choosing the contemplative life of a poor Clare nun. She eventually became the abbess of a new convent of Poor Clares in Bologna, which she helped found. Her holiness was widely recognized even during her lifetime. Catherine's most famous written work is Les Sept Armes Spirituales, the 7 Spiritual Weapons. This book isn't a collection of mystical visions, but a practical guide for spiritual struggle. In it, she outlines 7 weapons that a devout person, particularly a nun, could use to combat temptation and grow in virtue. These weapons include diligence, distrust of oneself, trust in God, mindfulness of Christ's passion, mindfulness of one's own death, mindfulness of God's glory, and following the authority of Holy Scripture. She wrote from her own experiences of spiritual trials and offered concrete advice. For example, she discussed how to discern between true divine inspirations and deceptive ones. The book was intended primarily for her sisters in the convent, but gained wider appeal for its clear and practical spiritual counsel. Beyond her writing, Catherine was also a talented artist. She painted religious images and illuminated manuscripts. Some of her artwork, including a breviary she is said to have illustrated, still exists. She also played the viola, indicating a multifaceted talent and a rich inner life. Her artistic endeavors were another way she expressed her devotion and instructed her community. This combination of mystical experience, practical guidance in writing, and artistic skill made her a remarkable figure. Perhaps the most startling fact about Catherine is what happened after her death in 1463. She was buried without a coffin, as was the custom for poor clerics. However, miracles were reported at her grave, and an unusually sweet scent was said to emanate from it. After 18 days, her body was exhumed and found to be incorrupt, perfectly preserved, flexible, and still emitting the sweet odor. Instead of reburying her, the nuns, with ecclesiastical permission, placed her body in a seated position in a special chapel within their convent church, Corpus Domini, in Bologna. And there she remains to this day, over 550 years later, dressed in her nun's habit, visible to pilgrims. This extraordinary preservation is considered a mark of her sainthood. Catherine of Bologna was canonized as a saint in 1712. Her writings continue to be studied, and her incorrupt body serves as a powerful, tangible link to this medieval nun who was a scholar, writer, artist, and spiritual guide. Number 7. Elizabeth of Schonau. The nun whose visions were read across Europe. Elizabeth of Schonau was a Benedictine nun in 12th century Germany who experienced a series of intense visions, which her brother Egbert meticulously recorded. Living at the Schonau Abbey, a double monastery, housing both monks and nuns in separate enclosures, Elizabeth began to have these profound spiritual experiences around the age of 23, often during times of great physical illness or distress. These weren't just fleeting images. They were complex, detailed encounters with angels, saints, and even Christ and the Virgin Mary. Her brother, Egbert, a monk at the male part of Schonau Abbey, and later abbot, became her confidant and scribe. Elizabeth would describe her visions to him, often in a state of ecstasy, and he would write them down in Latin. This collaboration resulted in several books, including the Liber Viarum Dei, Book of the Ways of God, which describes a symbolic journey through different paths, leading to salvation or damnation. Her visions often contained messages of warning and encouragement, calling for repentance, reform within the Church, and greater devotion among the faithful. She spoke out against the sins of the clergy and the laity alike, urging a return to Christian virtues. One of Elizabeth's most influential series of visions concerned Saint Ursula and her 11,000 virgin companions. While the legend of Ursula existed before Elizabeth, her vivid and detailed accounts greatly popularized the story and added many new elements that became standard in later tellings. She claimed to have learned through her visions the names of many of the companions, details of their martyrdom, and even the location of their relics in Cologne. These revelations sparked immense interest and led to the discovery of what were believed to be the bones of these virgin martyrs, turning Cologne into a major pilgrimage site. Elizabeth's writings were not kept secret within her monastery. They were copied and circulated, reaching a wide audience across Europe. She corresponded with other important religious figures, including the renowned Hildegard of Bingen, who was her contemporary. While some were as skeptical of her visions, many, including her brother and her monastic community, firmly believed in their divine origin. Elizabeth herself sometimes expressed doubt and fear about her experiences, but she felt compelled to share the messages she received. Her work shows a woman deeply engaged with the spiritual concerns of her time, using the accepted medium of visionary experience to convey powerful theological and moral ideas. Though she relied on her brother to transcribe and perhaps shape the Latin presentation of her visions, the content and the driving force behind them were hers. She became a significant religious voice in the 12th century, all from within the confines of her cloister. Number 6. Birgitta of Sweden. The mother of 8, who became a saint, royal advisor, and prolific visionary writer. Birgitta of Sweden, also known as Saint Bridget, lived a life of extraordinary contrasts and powerful impact during the turbulent 14th century. She was born into a noble Swedish family, married young, and became the mother of 8 children. For many years, she lived the life of a devout noblewoman, managing her household and serving as a lady-in-waiting to the Swedish queen. However, even during her married life, she experienced religious visions. After her husband's death, when Birgitta was in her early 40s, she fully dedicated herself to a religious path, and her visions intensified, becoming the central focus of her life. These visions, which she called revelations celestes, celestial revelations, were extensive and covered a vast range of topics. She reported conversations with Christ, the Virgin Mary, and numerous saints. They contained prophecies, allegories, instructions for her own life, and strong messages for popes, kings, queens, and clergy across Europe. Birgitta dictated her revelations, usually in Swedish, to her confessors, Peter of Scanning and Peter of Alvastra, who then translated them into Latin, the international language of scholarship and the Church. This collection of writings eventually filled several large volumes. Her messages were often direct and critical, condemning corruption, urging peace, and calling for church reform. She famously urged the popes to return to Rome from Avignon, where the papacy was then based. One of the most significant outcomes of her revelations was the divine instruction, as she reported it, to found a new religious order, the Order of the Most Holy Savior, commonly known as the Brigittines. She meticulously planned the rule and structure of this order, which was to include both nuns and monks in a double monastery, with the abbess as the overall head, symbolizing the Virgin Mary. She traveled to Rome in 1349 to seek papal approval for her new order, and spent much of the rest of her life there, tirelessly working for its establishment and continuing to promote her messages of reform. She also undertook a long and arduous pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. Birgitta's writings were not secret in the sense of being hidden. In fact, they were intended for wide dissemination and caused considerable debate. Some hailed her as a true prophet, while others were skeptical or critical of her bold pronouncements, especially those directed at powerful figures. The sheer volume and scope of her recorded revelations mark her as a major literary and religious figure. Her work provides a fascinating window into the religious and political anxieties of the 14th century. Birgitta was canonized as a saint in 1391, not long after her death. Her order spread throughout Europe, and her writings continued to be read and debated for centuries, influencing religious thought and practice. She was a wife, mother, visionary, writer, political commentator, and founder of a religious order, a truly multifaceted medieval woman. Number 5. Julian of Norwich. The anchoress, who wrote the first book in English by a woman, all about love. In the late 14th century, a woman named Julian lived a life of extreme seclusion as an anchoress in Norwich, England. An anchoress was a religious recluse, a woman who chose to be permanently enclosed in a small cell, usually attached to a church, to dedicate her life to prayer and contemplation. Despite this intense physical confinement, Julian of Norwich produced a work of profound spiritual insight and literary importance, Revelations of Divine Love. This book holds the distinction of being the earliest surviving book written in the English language by a woman. Julian's writings stem from a series of 16 intense visions, or showings, that she received in May 1373, when she was about 30 years old and suffering from a severe illness that brought her close to death. As she lay seemingly dying, she experienced these vivid encounters with Christ and insights into the nature of God. Miraculously, she recovered from her illness and spent the next decades of her life meditating on these visions and their meaning. She wrote 2 accounts of her experiences, an earlier, shorter version known as the short text, composed soon after the visions, and a much longer, more developed version, the long text, written perhaps 20 years later after much reflection. Her book is not just a record of visions. It's a deep theological exploration, particularly of God's overwhelming and unconditional love for humanity. In a time when images of God's judgment and wrath were common, Julian's theology is strikingly optimistic and comforting. She grapples with difficult questions, like the existence of sin and suffering, but consistently returns to the central message of God's all-encompassing love and mercy. One of her most famous lines is, "All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well." This wasn't a dismissal of sin, but a profound expression of trust in God's ultimate power to bring good out of all things. She also wrote about the motherhood of God, describing God's love in nurturing, maternal terms, which was an intimative and tender way of understanding the divine. Julian's life, as an anchoress, meant she was physically cut off from the world, yet her cell often had a window opening into the church and another to the outside, through which she could offer spiritual counsel to people who sought her out. So, while her writings may not have been widely circulated during her lifetime in the way a printed book would be today, she was not entirely isolated. A few manuscript copies of Revelations of Divine Love survived through the centuries, sometimes preserved in secret by English Catholics after the Reformation. Her work was largely forgotten until it was rediscovered and published more widely in the 20th century. Today, Julian of Norwich is recognized as one of England's most important mystical writers, a woman who, from her tiny stone cell, produced a timeless message of hope and divine love. Number 4. Arid of Landsberg. The abbess who created a magnificent illustrated encyclopedia for her nuns. Herod of Landsberg was an abbess in 12th century, Alsace, at the Hohenberg Abbey on Mont Saint-Odile. What makes her stand out is not just her leadership, but her incredible scholarly and artistic achievement, the compilation of the Hortus Delicarum, or Garden of Delights. This wasn't just a book. It was a massive illustrated encyclopedia intended for the education and spiritual enrichment of the nuns in her convent. It was a monumental effort to gather and synthesize the knowledge of her time into a single coherent work, created by a woman, for women. The Hortus Delicarum was a truly ambitious project. Completed around 1185, it contained excerpts from classical and pagan writers, the Church Fathers and contemporary theologians, covering a vast array of subjects: theology, philosophy. It included poems, hymns, and even musical notations. But perhaps its most striking feature was its illustrations. The manuscript was lavishly decorated with hundreds of miniatures, often full-page depicting biblical scenes, allegorical figures, historical events, and scientific diagrams. Many of these illustrations included extensive captions and explanations, often in both Latin and German, making the complex material more accessible to her nuns. Herod herself is credited with writing much of the original text and overseeing the entire production, including many of the illustrations. This encyclopedia was a testament to the high level of learning and culture that could exist within female monastic communities. Herod's purpose was clearly educational. She wanted to provide her nuns with a comprehensive understanding of Christian doctrine and the world around them, all within a framework of salvation history. The garden metaphor in the title suggests a place of learning and spiritual nourishment where her nuns could cultivate wisdom and virtue. The images were not mere decorations. They were integral to the teaching, serving as visual aids to understanding complex concepts and narratives. One famous image, for example, depicts philosophy as a queenly figure surrounded by the 7 liberal arts. Tragically, the original manuscript of the Hortus Deliciarum was destroyed in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War, when the library in Strasbourg where it was housed was bombarded and burned. This was an immeasurable loss to art history and women's history. However, fortunately, scholars had studied and copied parts of the manuscript, including many of its illustrations, in the decades before its destruction. These meticulous tracings and descriptions, though not a substitute for the original, allow us to appreciate the scope, beauty, and intellectual depth of Herod's work. Even in its reconstructed form, the Hortus Deliciarum stands as a powerful symbol of female scholarship, artistic creativity, and pedagogical innovation in the Middle Ages. Herod of Landsberg wasn't just an abbess. She was a visionary educator who created a unique and comprehensive world of knowledge for her community. Number 3. Héloïse d'Argenteuil, the brilliant scholar whose letters revealed her mind and heart. Héloïse d'Argenteuil, who lived in the early 12th century, is one of the most famous women of the Middle Ages, largely known for her tragic love affair with the philosopher Peter Abelard. But to remember her only for the romance is to overlook her formidable intellect and her own significant contributions as a scholar and abbess. Even before she met Abelard, Héloïse was renowned in Paris for her exceptional learning. She was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and deeply knowledgeable in classical literature and philosophy, an extraordinary level of education for a woman of her time. Her uncle Fulbert, a canon of Notre Dame Cathedral, was immensely proud of her scholarly achievements and hired the famous Abelard, then a leading intellectual in Paris, to be her tutor. Their lessons soon turned into a passionate love affair, resulting in a secret marriage and the birth of a child. When Fulbert discovered the relationship, his fury led to a brutal revenge. He had Abelard castrated. In the aftermath of this tragedy, both Abelard and Héloïse entered monastic life. Abelard as a monk, and Héloïse, reluctantly at first as a nun. She eventually became the prioress and then abbess of the Oratory of the Paraclete, a community founded by Abelard. It is through their extensive correspondence years after these dramatic events, that Heloise's scholarly mind and literary skill truly shine. These letters are not just personal outpourings of emotion, though they contain much of that. They are also sophisticated intellectual exchanges. Heloise engaged Abelard on complex theological and philosophical questions, often challenging his views and demonstrating her sharp, critical thinking. She quoted classical authors with ease and discussed the difficulties of monastic life for women. She questioned the nature of sin, intention, and divine justice, often with a raw honesty that is startling even today. For instance, she famously wrote about her continued love for Abelard and her struggles to reconcile her feelings with her monastic vows, expressing a depth of human experience rarely found in medieval text. As abbess of the Paraclete, Heloise was a capable administrator and spiritual leader. She sought Abelard's advice on establishing a rule specifically suited for her nuns, recognizing that rules written for monks were not always appropriate for women's communities. Her input shaped the Paraclete's unique identity. Her letters show her deep concern for the well-being and spiritual development of her sisters. While her personal story is undeniably dramatic and poignant, her scholarly reputation was established independently of Abelard. Her learning was praised by her contemporaries. The secret aspect of her scholarly life perhaps lies in the way her intellectual prowess is so powerfully revealed in what began as private correspondence, letters that laid bare not just her heart, but also the keenness of her mind. Number 2. Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim. The 10th century nun who wrote plays like a Roman, but with Christian heroines. Way back in the 10th century, long before Shakespeare, a nun named Hrotsvitha was writing plays. This fact alone is astonishing. Hrotsvitha, sometimes spelled Hotsvit or Raswitha, was a canoness at the Abbey of Gandersheim in Saxony, Germany. Gandersheim was an influential and wealthy imperial abbey, meaning it had close ties to the ruling Ottonian dynasty, and its members often came from noble families. This environment likely provided Hrotsvitha with access to a good library and the intellectual freedom to pursue her literary talents. She is considered the first known female playwright since antiquity, and the first known German female poet. Hrotsvitha wrote in Latin, the language of scholars. Her most famous works are 6 plays modeled on the style of the Roman playwright Terence. Terence's plays were popular in medieval schools for their elegant Latin, but their themes, often involving seductions, mistaken identities, and worldly affairs, were considered morally problematic by some Christians. Hrotsvitha stated her intention quite clearly. She wanted to provide a Christian alternative. She aimed to imitate Terence's form, but fill it with stories that celebrated Christian virtues, especially the chastity and fortitude of women. Her plays feature strong female protagonists who face trials, temptations, and martyrdom, but ultimately triumph spiritually. For example, in her play Dulcidius, 3 Christian virgins comically outwit a Roman governor who tries to force himself upon them. In Abraham, a hermit rescues his niece Mary from a life of prostitution, showing themes of repentance and forgiveness. Beyond her plays, Hrotsvitha was also a prolific writer of poetry and historical works. She wrote epic poems, including one about the deeds of Emperor Otto I, Gesta Ottonis, and another on the history of her own Gandersheim Abbey, Primordia Coenobii Gandishmensis. She also composed verse legends of saints, such as the story of Gongolvus and a narrative about the Passion of Saint Pelagius. Her writing demonstrates a remarkable command of Latin, knowledge of classical literature, Christian theology, and even some awareness of contemporary political events. She referred to herself as Clamor Validus Gandischmensis, the strong voice of Gandersheim. Hrotsvitha's work was not widely known outside her immediate circle during her lifetime or for many centuries afterward. Her manuscripts were rediscovered in the late 15th century in the St. Emmeram Monastery in Regensburg by the German humanist Conrad Keltis, who then published them. This rediscovery caused a sensation as it revealed a sophisticated female author from what was often considered a dark age. The secret nature of her scholarship lies in this long period of obscurity and the sheer unexpectedness of a 10th century nun writing dramas with such vivacity and skill. Her plays are particularly remarkable for their focus on female characters, their resilience, and their intellectual and spiritual strength, offering a counter-narrative to some of the more misogynistic views of her era. Hrotsvitha's unique voice echoes powerfully across more than 1,000 years. Number 1. Hildegard of Bingen. The polymath nun who composed music, wrote on medicine, theology, and even invented a secret language. Hildegard of Bingen, a German Benedictine abbess from the 12th century, was an absolute powerhouse of intellectual and creative energy. It's hard to categorize her because she excelled in so many fields. She was a visionary mystic, a theologian, a composer, a medical writer, a naturalist, a poet, and even the inventor of her own language. She was truly a polymath, one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire Middle Ages. From a very young age, Hildegard experienced religious visions which she called the shade of the living light. For many years, she kept these experiences largely to herself, confiding only in her mentor, Jutta von Sponheim, and a monk named Volmar, who later became her lifelong secretary. When she was in her early 40s, she received what she described as a divine command to write what you see and hear. Despite her initial hesitation and frequent illnesses, she began to dictate her visions to Volmar. Her first major theological work, Scivias, Know the Ways, the Lord Giba, took 10 years to complete and vividly describes her complex symbolic visions with detailed explanations. This was followed by other significant theological works, like Liber Vitae Meritorum, Book of Life's Merits, and Liber Divinorum Oberum, Book of Divine Works. These books are filled with imaginative imagery and profound theological insights. But Hildegard's talents didn't stop with theology. She was a gifted composer, and a large body of her musical work survives more than any other composer from the entire Middle Ages. Her compositions include liturgical songs for the church year, hymns and sequences, as well as a morality play called Ordo Virtutum, Order of the Virtues, which is one of the earliest known examples of this genre. Her music is highly original, characterized by soaring melodies and a wide vocal range. She also wrote extensively on medicine and natural history. Her 2 books on these subjects, Physica, Natural History, and Causae et Curae, Causes and Cures, detail the medicinal properties of plants, animals, and stones, and discuss human physiology and diseases from a holistic perspective, blending scientific observation with her theological understanding of creation. Perhaps one of the most curious aspects of Hildegard's genius was her creation of the lingua ignota, unknown language. This was a constructed language for which she devised an alphabet of 23 unique characters and a vocabulary of over 900 words, mostly nouns with a few adjectives, primarily for mystical or spiritual terms. The purpose of this language is not entirely clear. It may have been for private mystical contemplation, a secret code for her community, or an attempt to create a more perfect divine-like form of speech. Whatever its purpose, it demonstrates her incredible intellectuality. Hildegard was not a secret scholar in her own time. She was well known and highly respected. She corresponded with popes, emperors, kings, and other influential figures, often offering bold advice and admonitions. She undertook several preaching tours, a highly unusual activity for a woman at that time. She founded 2 new monasteries at Rubertsberg and Ebingen. Hildegard of Bingen was a visionary in every sense of the word, a woman whose intellect and spirit soared beyond the ordinary, leaving an indelible mark on Western civilization.